Folks, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Gabe Horwitz with Third Way. I don't need to tell you how important broadband is. You're probably watching the Zoom on broadband. Some of your kids are in the next room probably doing virtual school on broadband. Some of you are probably looking for new jobs on broadband. And don't worry, I'm not going to tell your boss. And look, others are going to have telemedicine appointments instead of going to the doctor later today. Broadband is not just a nice thing to have. It is essential to learn, to work, and to connect. But for tens of millions of Americans, high-speed broadband is either not available or they just can't afford it. Now, we know that the more rural an area is, the less likely it will have broadband. We know that low-income areas are less likely to be connected and people of color are less likely to be connected. And we know that access to broadband also differs based on educational attainment. Now, a lot has been done over the last year by both government and the private sector to connect people, and that's great. But the pandemic has made it clear that more action at the federal level is needed to ensure that everyone can get online. And that's why we're here today. Expanding broadband seems to be on everyone's policy wish list. Now, I'm joined by some innovative thinkers in this space to help us figure out how to turn it from a wish to a reality. Now, first, we're going to chat with Marc Morial, who's the president and CEO of the National Urban League. He's the former mayor of New Orleans, former head of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and the mayor doesn't have a ton of time, so we're going to have him for a few minutes, and then I know he needs to drop off. And after that, we're going to open it up to a panel and make sure that we have time for Q&A. So, Mayor, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Gabe. And let me just thank you and Third Way and everyone out there in broadband world for joining this afternoon. And let me frame the challenge before us in this way. The pandemic has reaffirmed something that we've long known, and that is that access to the internet in a full and meaningful way is a necessity and not a nicety. It is no longer a luxury. It is no longer something nice to have. It is essential to existence in this complex economic system and democratic system that we have here in the United States. We've seen with the pandemic, school children who neither have the availability of broadband or the affordability to adopt it get left completely out of virtual learning experiences. The stories of young children sitting outside of a fast food restaurant in order to grab onto their Wi-Fi to do their homework on a cell phone is an indictment of the policies that we've undertaken when it comes to broadband. Number two, we see seniors, and we'll see even more people get denied access to the vaccine because in order to gain access, they've got to make an appointment through a downloadable app that either they don't have the appropriate equipment or they don't know how to use the appropriate equipment, or the whole process is so anxiety ridden. Whatever the case is, these two elements of basic American life in the 21st century are inhibited by our broadband policies, which are antiquated and outmoded. In response to that, the National Urban League has prepared what we call the Lewis Latimer Plan, inspired by the Black inventor who worked alongside Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Alva Edison, who held many patents and has never gotten the appropriate credit for his role in the development of early technologies like electricity or the telephone. His plan, his name inspires our plan. And our plan revolves around three fundamental issues. Number one is availability, that all Americans everywhere, urban, suburban, rural, ought to have availability of high-speed, high-quality broadband. That is not the case today. There are many pockets in urban communities, suburban communities, and rural communities. The second A, and the first one being availability, is adoption. That even in instances where it may be available, people cannot afford the $60 to $75 a month cost of a sufficient broadband plan, and therefore are left out of having access to broadband. The third A, or related to the second A, I should say, is this concept of effective utilization, which is part of adoption. That people have the wherewithal, the understanding, the know-how to navigate a machine, a desktop machine, a tablet, a pad, a phone, to access the information and the knowledge that they need. The third A in the Latimer Plan is a very important one to the work of the national. It's access to economic opportunity. The internet revolution, which started certainly in the 80s and 90s, but truly accelerated in the early 2000s, has created tremendous wealth, tremendous job opportunities, tremendous economic momentum, but too much of those jobs, too much of that economic opportunity has bypassed African Americans and other communities of color. So it's our point of view that any plan to be credible, to be in the moment of where we are today in America in 2021, has to address all three A's: availability, adoption, and access. Now, just to offer just a few quick comments on availability and on adoption. On availability, I think we have an opportunity with the upcoming discussion about a broad-based infrastructure and economic recovery plan for us to think about broadband as the interstate highway system of the 21st century. Therefore, and thereby compelling a public commitment to match what I would hope would be an increased private commitment to move towards the concept of universal availability of high-speed broadband in every neighborhood, urban, rural, and suburban in the United States. We have an opportunity. We've got to make the case. We have to get people to think beyond traditional infrastructure, roads, bridges, and airports into thinking about it in a 21st century way. Number two, on adoption, the Lifeline program is in need of wholesale reformation, not a renovation, but a reformation and a transformation. It was never meant to be a broadband program. It's been tantamount to trying to make a round peg fit in a square hole. And efforts to retrofit the program to the digital age have simply not been successful. And there are many ideas contained in our plan about what you might do. Suffice it to say that we need to think about the combination of Lifeline and the E-rate program as programs which had their currency to meet the needs at the time they were designed. But now we're in the 21st century. We're in a different age. We're in a different era. If there is a guiding principle towards the solutions I think we all want to advocate for, it is that this has to be positioned as a public-private partnership, that this has to be thought of as a role so we don't get caught in the trap of the endless debate. Is it the private sector's responsibility? Is it the public sector's responsibility? All great things in America that closed economic gaps, that closed historic racial gaps, have been the dynamism of the government along with cooperation with the private sector. And I think that has to be our thinking going into this, with an important role at the table for those of us who advocate for the communities and the people that have been ill-served by the current system. This revolution continues. This revolution will be accelerated by the experiences we've had in the age of the pandemic and beyond. I have participated in 619 Zooms since the pandemic began. Thank you. My staff's been counting. They counted behind my back. They told me yesterday you've done 619. I said, wow, you all have been counting. But before the pandemic began, Zoom was a commercial I saw on TV. I knew not what it was. And now it has been a savior in our ability to host conferences, meetings, staff meetings, employee meetings, one-on-one interviews, job interviews, job evaluation. Everything we've done because of the technology that we have access to. So I'll stop there by saying that I appreciate the chance to just share a few thoughts with you all and end where I began. This is an issue because access, availability, adoption, and access are 21st century issues. This isn't an issue of necessity. We have to turn this into an instrument of equity, not an instrument of a continued divide.
Mayor, let me, that was so helpful and we really appreciate that. And thank you for also the number. The over under on the number of Zooms was set at 590 and I took the over, so I'm glad I did. Let me ask you one question before you leave us. In your latest book, which by the way is the best title ever, The Gumbo Coalition, it doesn't get better than that. You talk about uniting people to come together under a common cause. And I'm just wondering, how do we unite Congress on this issue to make real progress this year?
You know, I've thought about this a lot. One of the challenges with the Congress is that you come in a red shirt or a blue shirt. You're expected to always wear a red shirt or a blue shirt. And we've created a system in the Congress of winner take all. If you have 51% of the votes, you control the whole operation. I think that there has to be grassroots pressure. I think there has to be institutional pressure. I think there has to be, on an issue like this, a compulsion from the private sector, the community, local governments who are saying we want action, and we have some consensus around some of the things we want to do. I think without the external pressure, I think that the divisions that exist, particularly now post January 6th, are so difficult to overcome. Now, I will say this, I've been watching the division, but I've also been watching polling on some of the current issues, whether it's COVID, minimum wage, you name it. One thing that's becoming apparent is that the country is more united around certain things than politicians are, right? And that's a little bit of today's world. So I think we have to build the unity, Gabe, the collaboration, external, and then in a unified way, press the buttons that we can each press in the Congress. I think a traditional sort of inside game is just hard for me to imagine in these times.
Yeah. Well, folks, you heard it here. I think that's great advice. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Gabe.
We're going to get you on Zoom number 620.
All right, we'll be in touch. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
And for the rest of our panel, if you now could turn on your cameras. Wonderful. We're going to move to part 2. Thank you guys so much for joining us. It was great to hear Mayor Morial, and now I am really excited to talk to the three of you. Let me just tell our audience who we have here right now. We have Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee, is the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at Brookings. Many of you know her. She's an expert on equitable access to technology across the US and examines the intersection of race and wealth and technology. Shirley Bloomfield is the CEO of NTCA, which is the Rural Broadband Association. She's an expert on how telecom policies affect rural and remote communities and the benefits of rural broadband networks. And we've got Blair Levin, Senior Fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. He was at the FCC and also the Executive Director of the 2010 National Broadband Plan. So before I jump in, let me just give a quick reminder to the audience. If you have a question, all you need to do is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, use that Q&A tab, send a question to me. I'll make sure I ask as many as I can. But let's jump in. And I think, what Mayor Morial said about the 3 A's, I thought was really interesting. And I want to start with the first A, which is access, and really asking, how do we make sure that broadband reaches everyone? And Shirley, let me start with you. And Nicole and Blair, love for you guys to jump in as well. Are we confident we know what areas actually lack broadband, or do we need better visibility, better maps, and a better sense?
What a great place to start, Gabe, because when we start talking about broadband and access, you've got to be able to define the issue. And I was delighted when Congress actually passed legislation to move mapping forward, and really delighted when they decided to actually fund that initiative. Because the one thing we do know is we know where there is no broadband. We know that because nobody is claiming to serve that territory. So you've got that piece where you know that, and that's one thing you can put aside. That being said, the need for better maps is so critical because you've got so many cases where folks overstate what kind of coverage there is. That masks some of the existing unserved areas, and it makes it really difficult for us to actually size the problem. How big is the problem? What do we have to go for? And then the other thing I would say that's important on the mapping front is it's important to be more granular, and it's also important to be accurate. What we find a lot of times when people talk about their coverage is they turn it over to a marketing person who's like, yeah, we've got service out there. Yeah, we can cover these speeds. We need to know. It's a huge problem to make sure that these maps are more granular, because then we can set real standards for mapping and for how to actually solve this issue.
Yeah, I like that. That's a really interesting point. Nicole, Blair, anything else to add on that piece?
Yeah, thanks, Gabe, for having me. I'm just always happy to be around Shirley and Blair, and it was also great to hear from Marc. I actually want to say two things. The first and foremost, since we're sort of talking about frameworks for how we look at broadband, I introduced something that was more so related to a tech new deal before I jump into availability. And let me just tell you why. We know that in our society that we have these three legs of a stool, whether it's availability, accessibility, or adoption of broadband, is something that for 20 years I've been working on. But we also know that we're at this state with the pandemic that people are losing their lives. They're losing their lives because of the lack of access, whether it's not available in a rural or urban community, but they're also losing their lives because of the types of jobs they're involved in that are the livable wage scale jobs moving forward. I put out just a couple of weeks ago a plan around a tech new deal. And I want to actually frame it in my remarks in terms of availability, why that's important. Broadband is and technology access is not something that has been seen as complementary to economic recovery. And I think when we begin to talk about issues of availability and where broadband shows up, we are at a state right now where we are excited about the ability to have funding appropriated towards national mapping. But we also have to understand why 50 million school age kids, 15 to 16 million of them, did not have broadband access within blocks of their community or were not aware of that. And I think that for me has become a critical point as we look at how do we expand upon access, not just because people need to have it, because of the demand for broadband services or the supply of broadband services, but how do we actually engage broadband and technology as a means for solving systemic inequalities and driving people towards the type of individual and collective economic mobility that they require? And I say that with some passion, Gabe, because people who know me know I'm passionate about this.
Yeah.
Part of the challenge that we have is when last year I had a chance to talk to over 1,500 school educators who were trying to figure out who served their community. It went way beyond the conversation that we typically have in Washington, D.C., to who is somebody in a private sector or in public government that I can call on to make sure that I can get students online to learn. And as we see these disconnections have debilitating effects on Black and Brown communities and rural communities, we're now actually seeing regression, right, in terms of the learning outcome for those kids. So I just wanted to sort of think about that as well. I think that it's important for us to have a scope of the wholesale access that we have here in the United States. But I also think, and I could talk more about my tech new deal later, that we need to think about the extent to which we don't put broadband 10th on the list, but it's actually complementary to everything that we're doing in society. Because at the end of the day, as Blair and Shirley know, you can't do anything without broadband. You can't order, you can't live, you can't love, you can't see your family members without access to a connection. And that is why it is so critical to solve this problem.
Great points. I'm going to come back to a bunch of those in a minute. So thank you for raising them now. Blair, let me actually turn to you about something. You're muted, but
can I say something really quick?
Please. Yeah, absolutely.
Without broadband, everything else I agree with you, Nicole. But there's a critical point that actually precedes the mapping, which is what is the minimum definition of an unserved area? Our country ran an unintended experiment with COVID, challenging our notions of what that minimum is. And the FCC, in what is absolutely malpractice for an expert agency, didn't look at the results of that experiment to re-ask the question, what should we consider the minimum? So along with the FCC doing the mapping, they also have to do a task which should have occurred last year of reestablishing, and whether it's 50-50 or it's 50-10 or 100-100, people are saying what they think it should be. It'd be nice to actually have the data for what a family with 3 doing a job and having kids in school actually needs.
Yes.
And if I can jump in, I would also add to Blair's comment that one of the things we found, we actually did survey. I've got 850 providers across rural America. We actually did survey what they were seeing on their network. Blair, to your point about symmetrical speeds, critically important. We think of it as, I just need to download. Now we need to upload just as quickly. So I completely agree with your point. We're aiming way too low. We can do better than this.
And again, you got to let me just come in on that
Absolutely,
point.
please.
I completely agree with what Blair is talking about. I mean, what we saw Comcast do just recently in terms of increasing that speed, I think is an indication that we cannot have these stalls when it comes to people's access. I mean, I'm writing a book on this that will be out this fall on the digitally invisible. And what we're finding is that during this pandemic, as Blair indicated, it wasn't just one kid on a computer. In some households, there was actually one computer to 3 kids. Or there was an adult who was a frontline employee that also had to use that device. And this was universal across urban and rural America. So I think as we begin to position technology, I mean, I really think, Gabe, and to my colleagues, that we have to stop talking about it in third person, that it's imperative that we talk about it in first person so we can drive recovery in this manner.
Great point. Let me ask you all this then, because let's go under the assumption for a minute that we have agreement on minimum speeds. Let's go under the assumption that we know where all the homes that don't have a connection are. Before we get into adoption and affordability and all that, I'm just curious, how much money is actually needed to have broadband reach every home? And what's the best way to deploy that money? And I'll tell you, I'll just personally, we've struggled with this at Third Way because we see some estimates that say 20 billion. We see some that say 80. And there never seems to be a good agreement on what it's going to take what money it's going to take and how do we get that out. Blair, let me start with you and then let's go around. I'd love your take on what's needed to get broadband to reach every home.
Great. So in 2017, the FCC did a very extensive and I think highly reliable memo at that time that said it would cost $80 billion for the CapEx to connect every location, home and business, to fiber. Interestingly, the 80 billion, the first 40 billion would get us from 86% to 98%. And the last 40 would go from 98% to 100%. So you can see how the cost curve changes. And that raises a policy question of whether you want to be spending, significantly more to get from 98 to 100 than from 86 to 88. But that was order of magnitude 80. Since then, we've spent about 23 billion, but a lot of that was not on fiber. And so there's a question of whether that's wasted. We could talk about the most recent RDOF auction. I would say my own view is it's order of magnitude 30 to 50, but I trust other people more than me because I'm not on numbers. I'm somewhat suspect, but I think that would get us a very long way to solving the problem. The best way to allocate the funds is through a reverse auction, which the FCC has been doing recently and is highly superior to previous mechanisms for allocating the funds. Having said that, the most recent reverse auction is close to a disaster, if not a disaster. There were some mechanical things we could go into. Shirley knows this stuff extremely well, for how the FCC in its execution really screwed up. There are lots of different reasons why they screwed up, but they are not going to accomplish what they said in the press release they were going to accomplish. So we have to have both the right mechanism, which is that reverse auction, where we use competitive forces to lower the cost, but we also have to execute on it correctly. And maybe Shirley wants to follow that up.
Yeah, Shirley, do you agree with that?
I'm not as big a fan of reverse auctions as Blair is, and maybe in part because how we see some of these implemented, it becomes a little bit in my mind of a race to the bottom. You're talking about numbers. I agree. You know, the numbers float all over, and part of it is we don't know the right number because we don't have the map. So I do think there's that range that you're talking about, and absolutely that last 5% of people is most expensive. The one thing I would throw in to add to Blair's remarks is that it's not just the CapEx, it's the OpEx as well. You know, when you think about what is the cost, you can build the network, but if you can't sustain the network and you can't operate it, you then run into the affordability issue. So I look at it and I think, you know, particularly in a rural area, for example, doing a truck roll, you're not doing a truck roll down the street like you are here in Arlington, Virginia. You might be sending your tech out 2-3 hours to go, you know, check somebody's internal connections. So the CapEx and OpEx have to go together. Universal service, which is a really important program that is run by, you know, administered by the FCC, really used to focus on more of that affordability. It used to be less about CapEx and more about the OpEx piece. How do you get it to a point where more Americans can actually afford to have this service? You know, they've kind of moved into this quasi grant type of program and things like that. But I do think that, you know, we need to think of those things hand in hand when we're really evaluating what is the actual cost of building the network. And the last point I would say, before Nicol shows no passion for anything she talks about, is that we need to also be thinking about doing it right. You know, let's do it right the first time. I happen to be very bullish about, you know, putting fiber in where you can put fiber in. I think it is a future-proof technology. You put it in the ground, it has long-term capabilities, the ability to augment, to add, to jack up the speeds is kind of flip of the switch. I think we've seen some mistakes in the past where we've kind of done the, like, let's put a Band-Aid on, and then we're coming back 2 or 3 years later, surprise, doing more work. Let's use limited resources wisely and do it right.
Yeah, I mean,
tell us where you agree, tell us where you disagree.
You know, look, I think that what my colleagues have said is pretty much the case, right? We're using a combination of loans, grants, and auctions to sort of raise money to solve this infrastructure issue. I think the challenge is for the last few decades, we've not been able to solve the infrastructure issue, and that's primarily because it costs too much. Right. And as we get into areas, as Shirley's talking about in terms of rural, and having now, Shirley, gone out to your rural communities where there are a lot more cows than people, the bottom line is that there are just some technical challenges in addition to the type of financing that is necessary. I do want to pick up, though, on what Shirley is talking about, which is universal service. I mean, one of the roadblocks that we actually may have is that universal service is not flexible enough to allow for a variety of ways to actually connect communities. I mean, we are at this stage where we actually have a variety of Post-it notes that have come through best practices as well as tried practices through the reverse auctions, but we've not framed them well. And as a result of not framing them well or reforming programs like universal service, we're probably putting our money in places that, you know, don't need that much money or not targeted. And obviously that has a lot to do with the lack of sufficient mapping data. With that being said, I mean, I do suggest, and I'm a big fan of reforming the entire universal service program, making it much more technology agnostic, moving away from wholesale solutions, looking at not just the broadband problem as just a rural problem, but also urban, rural, and American problem, and finding ways to actually work with states to coordinate better investments where they think that there's a need for more data. Obviously, it's very hard to do that when you have a universal service program that is shrinking in terms of the types of contributions. You have to have that conversation on who is contributing and how much they're contributing and how much we're passing on to consumers. That's a whole nother panel that we can have, but modernizing it is really important. And then just picking up on what Blair and Shirley said as the last point, we do have to deal with the accessibility to that money. One of the things that the pandemic showed us is it just takes too long to get access to universal service money. So when we had these blind spots, because it was not necessarily on the national treasury or it wasn't an appropriation via, you know, government being able to give that money outside of stimulus, there were a lot of people that couldn't do anything. We could not actually build the type of infrastructure that was necessary to keep people connected to their doctors, school, work, and other mechanisms. And I'm sure Shirley can attest to that in rural communities. I heard the same, right? And so the question becomes, how do we look at universal service in the 21st century framework? And how do we combine the investments that we've made around infrastructure to also, in some cases, bring government in if it matters? I mean, the private sector plays a huge role in the development of US broadband networks, but they can't do it alone. And they definitely can't do it alone. We have platform companies that run off of those same networks that also suck into that bandwidth. So this has to be an all hands on deck approach to advancing the universal service program, finding out more ways to address affordability, and at the same time, leveraging the variety of technologies that we now have to ensure that we can get connectivity out there without being constrained by programs that were designed for previous iterations of the internet. So I would say I agree with them, but I do think it's very much time to do a radical reformation of universal service so that we can actually see it work. I think Shirley said it the right way versus, bits and pieces.
I want to get to that affordability question in a minute, but before we do, we've got two questions from the audience I want to pose to you guys. First one is, can the panel talk about the need for middle mile infrastructure to enable greater access and connectivity? Anybody have any opinions on that?
It's really important. Absolutely. And I look at middle mile and I think, if I've got a carrier in Dickinson, North Dakota, who's got to carry their traffic to Minneapolis to have that transport out, those are high costs. And I think, particularly in a rural area, because you're talking about distance and distance equals cost. So yeah, I think it's something that too often gets people get so focused on that final mile connecting to the home. We need to think about the entire infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's fair. Let me ask one more. Let me ask one more question, then I want to turn it around because I know there's been a ton of questions about affordability here. But before I do, what can Congress do to ensure the phase 2 auction for the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is better implemented other than waiting for the updated maps? Anybody have opinions on that?
Yeah, Congress, in a sense, already did it. They sent a letter to the FCC signed by 157 members, very bipartisan, very heavy on leadership, that should be interpreted as saying to the new chair, during the long form application process, you should be free to take away money, or to basically say the people who promised to do a gig and have no experience doing a gig, the people promised to do a gig using wireless, even though there's no evidence that can be done, and other problems, to essentially say, we're going to use this process to say, okay, you didn't win, we're going to take the money back, or we never gave you the money, and we'll just rerun the auction. So that's probably all that needs to be done. There'll probably be some oversight hearings to, shall we say, reinforce that message.
And the only thing I would
say on the middle mile thing, I think people should remember the Obama administration spent money on that. It's politically difficult because there does seem to be a bipartisan consensus that public money should not be used to compete with private money, and when a home is not connected, it's fairly clear, but middle mile, the maps are trickier. So the politics of filling in the middle mile, and Shirley's absolutely right, it's very critical to the operating costs are important, but there is a political challenge.
Yeah, and I would agree too on first the middle mile. I think it is imperative that we actually understand what the middle mile is in terms of its resources, and we ensure that what Shirley's talking about, because I saw this on a lot of my travels, that we pay attention to that, because in some cases getting it to the home is important, but it's also important to make sure that you can get that connectivity from other places in between. And I think the pandemic has evidenced how important it is to have access generally within communities. And I also think with Congress, I do agree with Blair that Congress, particularly in a party shift, is making certain decisions to sort of reevaluate that auction and to see how we're actually going to impress upon direct outcomes, which again, and I think all of us would say the same thing. If you look at the national mapping, for example, now the exclusion of schools and libraries are not in there. So what does that say about how rich and robust those maps will be? We definitely need to go back to the table and make sure we're making targeted investments. And I would just say this also, even when we think about the broader mapping, I do want to continue to say, Gabe, that it's important to understand when we talk about rural, and Shirley could attest to this, not just the rural communities that we know about, but let's go deep into the Black Belt of Mississippi and Louisiana and other places where we have migrant workers and other workers who have been systemically excluded from the general mainstream activities that the internet provides. It's really important on this round that we really think about who is being foreclosed on because they do not have access to the internet. And that's not always who we think of when we think of rural, right? We don't think of people, yes, they don't have running water, but worse yet, they don't have access or a pipeline out to the real world. So we need to make sure that also happens.
Absolutely.
And I'm just going to jump in because we were
Please.
talking about the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and Blair had teed it up perfectly. And Nicole, with your comments about let's not forget those forgotten consumers. You know, my big fear is I think Congress did a great job by weighing in the letter timely. You know, we've got now a new administration, new leadership kind of taking over this next stage of due diligence and hopefully transparency. But at the end of the day, I think it is really important for Congress to remember that if this job can't be done, won't be done, doesn't meet the specs and standards, it is rural consumers. It is those people who were celebrating when the news came out that somebody bid to serve on their territory. And I will tell you, I look at the fact it was basically a $20 billion fund and they're allocating about half, which leads me to think these people will not get served. The promises will not be met, and it is American consumers that will be the losers here. So it is one of those things. What I hope Congress also does is stay on the case. You know, let's not wait 4 years down the road when somebody comes back in and says, "Oh, by the way, you know what? I can't really live up to what I said I was going to do. I'm sorry. Here's the money back, or here's my penalty, or whatever it might be." We need to stay on this. This is too important, too trans, you know, it's just too critical right now. And people are waiting. They've already been waiting and they're going to wait longer. And what I hate to see is them wait and then be told 4 years down the road, oops, we don't have time for oops anymore.
That's right.
We do not. And, you know, let's now switch gears a little. We've referenced this a little bit before, but I do want to talk a little bit about adoption. And I was reading the report that Marc Morial referenced earlier on, and he notes that the adoption gap is approximately 3 times larger than the availability gap. And part of this is digital readiness, and part of this is affordability. And I would like all of your takes when it comes to affordability. How do we make sure that low-income families can afford broadband? We've talked about some programs that are happening now. I don't know if we need to reform those. I don't know if we need new programs. Blair, let me start with you. Let's go to Nicole. Let's go to Shirley after that. If you could wave your magic wand, what would you do to boost affordability?
Well, let me first just disclose that I've been working with Marc and his team since July on the Latimer plan. And so
then I was using your stat. Thank you,
well,
Blair.
yeah, actually you're using John Horrigan's stats, but whatever, and John's working on the project as well. The first thing to understand is, as Marc said, is that the current program Lifeline is not working. It is not working to get people on broadband. The second point I would make is we actually need to have people have both access to mobile devices, which Lifeline doesn't do it well, but it does it, and in home, which it doesn't do at all. And so what we really want is kind of a different program that covers both the mobile and the in-home. Part of the problem, and Nicole was talking about this earlier, is that the current system does not provide sufficient funding, and yet it is collapsing because of the way universal service contributions are structured. So you have to deal with both sides of this. We could go into great detail. Hopefully the Latimer plan will be revealed in full within a few weeks by the end of the month. What I would say is there are 2 different approaches, both of which have tremendous merit in my view, and we'll see what Congress does. One is simply having an in-home broadband that everybody of a certain income level has access to. Verizon actually proposed something like this, and there's a mechanism in terms of, you know, digital benefit cards that make it easier. And there are certain things I think there's now a consensus on, not requiring companies offering it to be so-called eligible telecommunication carriers. Shirley may disagree, but I think there's a growing consensus about that. So that's one. I worry about the political sustainability of that one, but we could chat about that. A second is a functional approach, which is we look at those functions that we want to make sure people have the ability to do. The 3 that are most mentioned and have already been mentioned. Number 1, every kid should be able to do their homework at home, as well as engage in other online educational experiences outside the classroom. Number two, we want people to be able to take advantage of telehealth. And I would note that Medicare, or maybe it was Medicaid, less than 1% of the visits to medical professionals in February of 2020 were over telehealth. And by April, over 40% were. And that's not going back. So if you're not connected in home, you are essentially losing access to a lot of healthcare services. The third thing are jobs. If you don't have a job and you want to train, search, apply, interview for a job, you have to be on broadband, and going to the library just does not cut it, unfortunately. So you could have a system, and we'll discuss this in greater detail in the actual plan. Congress really needs to fund the homework app, but the mechanics of administering it are a little bit tricky because you need the schools to be very involved. The single biggest thing that could happen would be if Medicaid, along with Medicare and Veterans, which are the three big insurance policies run by the government, if they were to give a broadband benefit to people of a certain low income, that would cover literally tens of millions of people. And here's the great part, they will actually save money in the long run. There was a very interesting experiment in Liverpool, England, which showed this, and there are some other things. Just obvious that if you have people online, their healthcare, you can monitor, you can check in, you can schedule appointments. It's a lot easier for everybody. There's actually savings in that insurance system. And then the third would be, if you become unemployed, you get a broadband benefit, because we don't want you to not pay for your broadband while you're trying to find a new job. Again, the system saves money because people who have broadband in the home tend to find jobs faster than those who don't. Of course, there could be lots of different reasons for that, but the big thing seems to be, if you're looking for a job and you can only do it once a week when you go to a library and wait in line for 3 hours for a half an hour, it doesn't work as well. So keeping people on actually saves money to the system. So that's a different approach, more complicated, but I think maybe sustainable over time. But better minds than mine will figure out which is the best way to do it. But I think all three of us agree it has to change rather dramatically.
Yeah, great pragmatic ideas. I like that a lot. Nicole, let me turn to you. What would you add to that?
Yeah, so I have to also put out there, I haven't read the Lewis Ladder plan, so I'll put that on my reading list of things to look. I'm working on my book, so that's been my priority. Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, Brookings Press in the fall. So I would say, to the answer what Blair had just said, I mean, clearly we need to do for the affordability gap a couple things, and this is not something that's new. We've been dealing with this for decades. First and foremost, universal service as it's structured is broken. So we do need to go in and look at universal service, and we need to look at the funds that are available and the capture rate of the current Lifeline program to even know if it's the right mechanism to stir the type of affordability resources that we need. First and foremost, I mean, if the capture rate is so low, we all know historically it's been under 40%. What does that say when people have broadband insecurities? I mean, just like housing and food insecurities, we saw in this last 12 to 13 months broadband insecurities, people needing access because they had no other choice but to be online versus inline. If that is the case, then we need to do a better job of doing a couple things. I mean, making the benefit of Lifeline much more competitive so low-income people don't feel like they're actually getting some type of new subsidy program that places them and targets them and creates a narrative of poverty. But we need to think about, do we have enough providers in the pot? Have we made it seamless and easy? Years ago, I used to talk about at MMTC, having it where it was a competitive benefit where people can make their own choices versus the company, et cetera. I think that's still very, very important. I also think when we talk about affordability, we need to think about the way in which technology itself can be emboldened to actually amplify this $9 benefit. I mean, the fact that we're still talking about a $9 benefit since 1986 is just trifling. And why is that the case? We now see a broadband service where people can actually exempt or zero rate things like Spotify or Pandora, but they can't get to a .gov site to apply for a job. When I was doing my research, in rural areas, Shirley, as a matter of fact, we had day laborers who ran out of minutes and could not search for a job or get contact on a job simply because their phone went out. That's another concern. How are we leveraging new technological advances to make available to every American a .gov website where they can get online and actually do the things that Blair is talking about? I think it's also important, again, going back to just the federal side of this, to think about universal service in terms of contribution. We have a consolidated marketplace of telecom providers who actually qualify to actually pay into that fund. What about the other folks who are actually leveraging that fund? Have we thought about just a small percentage of ad revenue from platform companies that can actually blow out the fund in ways that we never imagined? Now, all of these take time. They have statutory limits. There's time to change statutes, but it's particularly important that we think about the flexibility. What Blair said with E-rate, we've got 15 to 16 million kids at home, but yet we can't find a way to get them out of a digital parking lot and put them in their homes so they can actually do their homework. That's something that we should be continuously thinking about. How do we change that to be more adaptable to 21st century rules? But I also want to change this conversation, Gabe, just for one more thing to think about, is that when we think about adoption, we tend to think about adoption on the standpoint of how do we get broadband to people versus getting people into the broadband ecosystem. I think it's particularly important as well to think about adoption in terms of workforce development. How are we getting tools to folks so not that they can apply for a job, but they can be prepared for broadband jobs? I think there's some legislation on the Hill right now talking about broadband and related jobs. These jobs pay livable wage scale jobs. There should be credentialing. There should be apprenticeships to the Department of Labor. There should be benefits that come out of DOL to people to get online, Veterans Affairs, wherever people are. We should not be treating broadband as a luxury of the elite. And we already know that that's not the case because most people have it. The question is, are we channeling federal resources to make it more productive? And I would say the same thing and here with states. Are states given the flexibility or municipalities to actually invest in adoption programs? We cannot do it by ourselves. And so we need the folks that Shirley was talking about to have access to resources, to be creative, to ensure that people are using broadband for the things that Blair talked about: healthcare, education, employment.
Shirley, let me turn to you.
Wow, that is a tough act to follow. So just a couple of things. I would say, yes, universal service does need to be reformed. That is key for affordability. It just is, whether you're talking about low income, you're talking about high cost, you're talking about schools and education, library support, rural healthcare in general. The one thing I would say is people like to kind of default to, well, let's just have Congress appropriate it. I'm totally going to work with Nicol, because absolutely, those who use those platforms, those who use those networks should also help support. It is not sustainable. The contribution factor rate is like 33%. It is not sustainable. It is built on an archaic system, but we need that support. But I worry that people default to appropriations, then you're subject to the will of Congress. You can't build networks, you can't put programs in place, because then it just becomes on the annual chopping block. So I would certainly throw that out there. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in all those areas. And in terms of, Nicol also raised another interesting point, the role of states. And it's one thing I don't want to underestimate, whether it is adoption programs, and even if it's deployment programs, where I have seen states do amazing work, just plugging in the holes. They know where those gaps are. They know their communities. They know where there's problems. They know where you might have, a tribal school. They know it. So watching the federal kind of do their thing, but I have loved watching states. I mean, I saw Iowa this year, the governor put out $450 million over the next couple of years. Those kinds of initiatives are also going to really make some great headway. So I think we need to be mindful of where those federal and state partnerships can also play a role.
So before I know we're running out of time here, so I want to ask one more question, and it's something, since there's a lot of policymakers on this Zoom who come and have the same question. They say, what can we get done this year? And when I think about this year, I think about great opportunity. I think about multiple reconciliation bills. I think about a new administration that wants to be very active on these issues. But then there's also challenges. We have, a very, very, very close House and Senate with not a lot of room to maneuver. Shirley, let me start with you. What do you think can get done this year? What would you like to see realistically get done this year?
So I will not make a joke about Infrastructure Week, Gabe, but I will tell you,
we're all scarred.
It is time. It is time. Like, if there's anything that could be bicameral, bipartisan, rural, urban, inner city, whatever, it is exactly what Marc said earlier. It is the 21st century infrastructure program. We need to commit. We need to be mindful of it, because again, it takes money. It just does. I wish there was a magic wand. There is no magic wand. It's going to take resources. The second thing that I will say is something that Nicol also hit upon, is workforce development. I think, we had recently reached out to the Biden administration supporting an apprenticeship program. You've got people who want jobs. we can't find the staff in our areas. We can't keep the staff in our areas to build these networks. We are already, my folks are already having delays because they can't get construction crews, they can't get in-home techs, they train people, they go off to a big city. I think it's time, frankly, for us as a country to think bigger and bolder on that too, right? Like I look back and I think, what about the PWA in the New Deal? How do you marry up two problems that we are facing and potentially look to solve both of them through a workforce development program? So those are just a couple of, we've got to do it because you know what, it's not fast. Broadband takes a while to put into the ground. It just does. You got to plan for it. You do your business case. You got to get construction crews. Right now, we can't get equipment from overseas because of the pandemic and because of supply chain issues. So my guys are already being told there's a 6 to 9 month wait on fiber and CPE, in-home equipment for consumers. We gotta accelerate what we're doing.
Blair, before I turn to you and then Nicole after that, I do want to just point out, because workforce development is a huge thing. I wish we had more time to talk about it. The House, for those who haven't seen this, just passed the National Apprenticeship Act of 2021. It's a great bill. I would love to see it move in the Senate. And it would do a lot to expand apprenticeships to these exact areas that we're talking about. But Blair, let me turn it to you. What would you like to see happen this year? What do you think can happen this year?
I think that question, it'd be nice to know 2 weeks from now what the mood of the country and the Congress is kind of post-impeachment. Sure. And what its reaction is when Biden lays out his infrastructure plan. I certainly agree that rural broadband is a critical component of any infrastructure bill, both for good policy reasons and for political reasons. I also think that when I talk to my Republican friends, and unfortunately I worked in the government when one could still have them, and I still treasure that. I think there is broad agreement that America would be much better off if we had networks everywhere, everybody on, and utilize the networks to improve how we deliver essential services. And the market forces will not deliver that. Even the most conservative Republicans, I know, agree that they won't deliver it. So the discussion, if we can have an honorable civil discussion about tactically how we do that, I think an awful lot can be accomplished. But I just don't know in this environment, ironically, somewhat fueled by the way social media has put us into kind of more radicalized areas, and where we're not focusing on policy but focusing on simply complaining and whining. I really don't know what's possible, but hopefully a few weeks from now we'll maybe see a better environment.
That's fair. Nicole, let me close it out with you.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody for participating who's been listening, and to my colleagues here. It was always a pleasure to be on the panel with them. I would say this. I mean, I'm going to be selfish again and plug the fact that we need to do something, as Marc mentioned. And whether it's a Lattimore plan or it's a tech new deal, preferably a tech new deal is fine. But the more people I can have actually talking about this, the better, because I do think it goes back to what Shirley said. This issue that we're at right now, what Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to deal with, which is how do I bring back to life the economic and social viability of our country? And we're struggling right now. So I just put this out on that tech new deal. When you think about the next time you order food or you order groceries or you're getting your 14-year-old snuggled up in front of a computer, think about the fact that this is the new normal. And if we don't embrace the new normal as part of the larger grand scheme of how we actually get back, it's not just about using the web for scheduling of vaccinations. It's about using not just the Internet 2.0, but artificial intelligence and other technologies to make sure we're just a better country overall. I do think with that in mind, I would also add that as we think about school reopening, I would say to the administration that it's not just about PPE. It's about the fact that today it's a pandemic, tomorrow it'll be a California wildfire. Sometime after that, it might be an increased surge in the virus. Again, we need to ensure that no child is left offline. And I'm confident with the acting chairwoman of the FCC that closing the homework gap will be important, but also making sure that every backpack is equipped with some type of digital device, a hotspot, in addition to a pencil, as well as the resources that parents need to keep their kids safe online. And then I would say, finally, one part we didn't talk about, Gabe, in addition to the workforce, being an issue for me as a concern, I've already expressed that, is that we need to look at this moment as an opportunity to invest back into communities. 100,000 small businesses were permanently closed as a result of this pandemic. 100,000. That was in rural, that was in urban. For Black and brown communities, it was more than half of those businesses actually were coming from those communities. What does that say about the future investments that we need to make into the tech ecosystem? And sort of to what we've been insinuating, what does that also say, in addition to workforce, what we need to be doing to raise up a national digital service corps so that people can actually engage their communities around all of this vacant space and these vacant and unused equipment that is actually going to go barren when we have kids struggling to figure out whether or not they can get connectivity at home. I really hope that this moment of time that we're in is not just decades of planning, but we're actually in that moment of action. And I think, as Shirley put it best, people can't wait anymore. They can't wait anymore. They're sitting by themselves in rural communities, just holed up, waiting for when it's safe to go outside. And so we need to do the diligence of making sure that they can, and they also are connected to resources they need, like doctors, that they can actually do from the comfort of their home. So I think, Gabe, you got to bring us back because we got a lot more to talk about.
I would love to. This is always the tricky part about these is I have so much more to ask you. I would love to get so much more of your wisdom, but I think ending it on that call for a moment of action is a great place to end. So I want to just say thank you to all of you. And one thing that I would encourage everyone listening and watching is use these folks. They have written on this. They have lived this. They have, as you can tell, incredible thoughts and ideas and advice as you are slogging through all of these issues over the coming years. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of Third Way and everybody here, and looking forward to continuing this conversation soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Guys.